Revolutionary greetings, comrades. We continue discussing the program of the Zimbabwe Communist Party titled Completing the Liberation of Zimbabwe. As promised, we are looking into the Economic Structural Adjustment Program. We are going to break this discussion into two parts because it is a bit longer, though we're doing a summary. We want to keep our videos to be plus or minus 15 minutes so that comrades will participate in the discussion. If it is long, comrades might be discouraged. And the other issue is around data, which as communists and the workers, we must launch a campaign for data to fall. Comrades have always said, or some comrades, if I were to put it in that way, have always said that the roots of our economic collapse must be located in the socialist policies that were introduced by ZANU-PF in 1980. This is not accurate. In the first decade of our majority rule, that is from 1980 to 1990, we were not under socialism. ZANU-PF did not introduce socialist policies. What happened is that we continued with what we inherited from the Rhodesians, that is national planning and state control, something which we support, and we have explained why we differ with the Rhodesians. So Zimbabwe has never implemented socialist policies. We all know, comrades, that Bernard Chidzero, who was trained in the West, became the Minister of Finance in 1985. And we do recall that Bernard Chidzero was an efficient accountant and administrator of state funds, but ideologically, he was a neoliberal, and he was the architect of the Economic Structural Adjustment Program, which destroyed the strong but largely internalized economy of Zimbabwe, because the economy was internalized, as we explained previously, because of what happened when the British put sanctions or imposed sanctions when the Smith administration unilaterally declared independence on the 11th of November 1965. Bernard Chidzero was, as we were saying, a neoliberal, and today we have another neoliberal as Minister of Finance, Professor Ntuli Ncube. Apart from the personal intervention of Chidzero, there were other factors which pushed Zimbabwe into ESAP. Money had been borrowed for social development without a corresponding increase in production, and the debts had to be repaid. This also had a factor in pushing government to then look to the West, and what they were then told, because of these challenges that they were facing, they were told that free market reform was the way to go. There was also a massive population increase during the 1980s, which put pressure on the education system. Excuse me. This coincided with the growing counter-revolution in Eastern Europe, which was used as in a number of countries to advance structural adjustment program. And we are seeing what is happening today in Russia, Ukraine, which we have discussed previously. At the time, in the 80s, we recall that in 1984, ZANU-PF had adopted at its Congress what it called the Leadership Code. The Leadership Code was meant to guide the political leadership to force, so to speak, the political leadership to live within the masses. That is to say, not to be seen living in luxury as we see today. But of course, you also remember the words by the late Edson Zopo that he never saw a socialist in ZANU-PF. And we know also that part of the problem that contributed to the destruction of our economy was nepotism, corruption. The Unity Accord, as we discussed previously, as signed by ZANU-PF and the PF ZAPU in 1987, at its 1989 Congress in Mutare, which was called the Unity Congress, had adopted Marxism-Leninism as its key guiding ideology. But of course, as we have said, there's no evidence on the ground that there were any policies that socialist policies that were implemented by ZANU-PF. It was that ideology was just a rhetoric. It was dropped when ESAP was adopted in 1991. But of course, the political leadership always used Marxism for political expediency. It was not really grounded in terms of developing our economy along socialist lines. In the 1980s, Zimbabwe was a star performer in Africa in the provision of social services and in the reconstruction and development of its public infrastructure. This was as a result of national planning and state control, which we are saying was inherited from the Rhodesians. Average life expectancy was on the rise, childhood mortality was down, and other measuring sticks such as the literacy rate and the technical skills capacity were encouraging. You will recall that in the 80s and early 90s, a number of our young people went through what we called apprenticeship, where Zimbabwe developed a skilled workforce. Zimbabwe's structural adjustment program contained the usual collection of bank-inspired reforms, trade and currency deregulation, devaluation of the Zimbabwe dollar. This is what is always been said. Movement towards high real interest rates, the lifting of price controls, chopping of social spending, and removal of consumer subsidies. All were standard ingredients of liberalization, as was the increasing emphasis on reduction of the government deficit, civil service reform, and the shedding of public enterprises. There was a string of large loans and crediting facilities from the World Bank and the IMF and international donors aimed at supporting the country's balance of payments and government plans for substantial private sector infrastructural development. And at the time, it was expected that Zimbabwe was going to receive $3 billion US over 5 years from international donors. Zimbabwe would spend its way into the free market on borrowed money. When you borrow money, the principle is simple. You must pay back the money. There's no commercial bank that can just give you money. Government and its bankers said the new investment would be focused on modernizing the infrastructure sector, which would enable the country to compete in international markets and earn the hard currency needed to pay back ESAP's underpinning foreign loans. An optimistic target of 5% annual growth in GDP was set up by World Bank and the government. It's important also to note because recently, comrades, in a number of social media platforms, they are posting whether it's Bulawayo Nkai Road, which has not been rehabilitated since the 1960s or whenever, and a number of roads across the country. You can hardly point out any infrastructural development that happened after 1991 to date. Yes, you might talk about the Chavez Dam, You might talk about the dam in Mukusi Dam in Maswingo, but you can hardly speak of any development that happened during the period of the implementation of the economic structural adjustment program. Government fiscal restraint involving reduction of services, the investment of public corporations, and the layoffs in the government sector were aimed at reducing the status deficit from the usual 10% to 5% or less. The government admitted this raised higher unemployment and higher consumer prices in the short term, but Zimbabweans were promised rising real standard of living, long-term employment expansion, and a modern, growing, internationally competitive economy. If you study the mining sector in Zimbabwe, particularly in 1992, many mining companies had to lay off workers. A number of manufacturing industries had to lay off workers around 1992, 1993. And of course, which we'll discuss in the second segment of this discussion, the drought of 1992 also contributed to an extent that when the rains came back in 1993, almost 50% of the population was on food aid. And we also look at the migration, which is, of course, is an interesting discussion in South Africa and within the migrant community. The migration of Zimbabweans happened at that time, 1992, 1993, and the gates were opened in 1994 when there was a democratic breakthrough in South Africa. So, and this was as a result of the failure of the economic structural adjustment program to meet its targets, because the jobs were lost at that time, and the people that were working in industries that were closed because of the economic structural adjustment program began to flock into South Africa. Many young people that had gone through apprenticeship had also to leave and flock to South Africa. So the migration question must also be understood from the point of view on the failure by the economic structural adjustment program to achieve its set targets, which of course from the word go, you will know that workers in Zimbabwe opposed the economic structural adjustment program. The Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions began to mobilize against the implementation of the economic structural adjustment program. And of course, the economic structural adjustment program is not different from GEAR, which was adopted in 1996 in South Africa, what the South African Communist Party characterized as a class project. If you read the GEAR document, you read the economic structural adjustment program document, there's no much difference in terms of what it sought to achieve. And of course, in Zimbabwe, we know that ESAP never achieved anything, but we'll continue discussing in the second segment so that we have a better understanding. But we also refer comrades to read, because we have said this is not in detail. Comrades should find time and read a thesis by Professor Patrick Bond of Wits University. I think he's still at Wits Business School. I always talk to him. His thesis that he wrote, which I think was published in 2000, titled Zimbabwe's Economic Crisis, Outwards versus Inwards Developmental Strategy for Post-Nationalist Zimbabwe. He traces the political economy of Zimbabwe from 1890 up to around 2000. So it is in a bit detail than maybe what we have done in our own program, completing the liberation of Zimbabwe. So it will give comrades a better understanding of the Zimbabwe political economy from 1890. Otherwise, comrades, write your views. I know that, well, I call them comrades, liberals, are waiting for us in some chat group to say, Comrade Mapena, this is not correct. Yes, we accept criticism. No, so let's continue having this discussion. We'll continue in the next segment. Otherwise, please write your comments, like the video, please subscribe. Amandla, comrades.